Okay, we've officially titled this "Beers with Schuyler." If Obama can do it, so can we.
That's right.
Okay, so we've established that the energy bills are. So what Schuyler and I are going to talk about, sorry, Senator VanValkenburg,
Schuyler, please.
is why. We want to talk a little bit about the cost drivers. And energy is a complex topic, and a lot of times utility monopolies and large companies use that complexity to try to pull the wool over our eyes. And we want to pull that back and get down to what's driving the cost of energy. So let me start with a major development in Virginia that 5 years ago, when the Virginia Clean Economy Act was passed, we weren't really talking about that much, and that's data centers. Last night we were in Manassas. Virginia is the now data center capital, really, of the world, and the stats are staggering. So my first question to you is, how does the staggering demand of data centers lead to higher prices for all Virginians?
Yeah, well, it's interesting when we passed the Clean Economy Act back in 2020 to get to 100% clean energy. At that time, Virginia had flat energy load growth, right? Which means essentially we weren't, the amount of energy we needed over time was not growing. And in the 5 years that has happened, of course, data centers happened. And as you all probably know, they use a ton of energy, right? They're very energy intensive. And as a result of that, we're seeing our energy needs skyrocket. And the TLDR, right? Like the let's not get into the weeds on this too much, right? Is anytime we need to build energy to have more energy that goes into your bills. And if there's this entity that's requiring a massive amount of energy, right? There's a massive amount of building, and that's going into your bills. And because they're so new, I think we're in this kind of environment where the state hasn't really done that much, right, to try to figure out how to solve for that. There were some attempts last year. People had started talking about it 2 years ago, but figuring out how to solve that problem, I think, is one of the most pressing issues we have. And it often, it's interesting. There's a ton of questions around data centers. I think we're focusing on the energy piece of it. There's the should they go in your neighborhood question. There's the where should they go question, which we'll kind of table that. I mean, there's places they probably should go. There's places they definitely should not go.
Or should they go at all?
Yeah. Well, there's the whole AI. What's our future life look like question, which I think is existential and for another day. That's for 5 years. But when we're thinking about the energy question, there's a lot of things we need to think about, and maybe I'll just end with a possible solution, and then
Sure.
you can follow up. I think if you watch the governor's debate, the gubernatorial debate, Abigail Spanberger talked about they need to pay their fair share, and I really think that's the baseline, right? The baseline is they need to pay their fair share. What that looks like in terms of legislative language, I'll be very honest with you, I don't know in the moment, right?
Yeah.
But they need to pay their fair share. But it needs to be more than that. It needs to be about energy standards, and tying them to energy standards so they're not using so damn much energy. And I think we really need to be thinking about if we are going to be a home for them, and we already kind of are, right? So we already kind of are a home for them. We need to figure out how we're going to make up our energy deficit. You also heard Spanberger talk about how we're the biggest importer of energy. Of all the states in the country, and that's not a really good place to be in for a lot of reasons. And how can we close that delta, right? How can we make sure we have enough energy? Even if you say, even if you're Dominion can do that, right? Dominion can't do all that, right? Even if you're the most pro on the side of the utility, they're never wrong, politician, interest group, whatever, they can't fill that gap in the time in which we need them to fill it. And so we need to figure out a way to bring in third parties that can help starting to fill that gap. Preferably, of course, with energy that's not polluting.
And have you seen data center development in your district in the last few years?
Seen data center development around my district, right? Data centers became most famous and are kind of most controversial in Prince William and Loudoun County, where they were first. But as many people in this room know, Windham in the West End and in the East End, there's lots of controversy and questions about data centers. And I think, a lot of that is typically around where they go, which I think is very understandable. That's the thing that's most concretely in your face. And sometimes they should go where they go, and sometimes they shouldn't go where they go. But I think one of the things that I'm glad we're talking about here, and one of the things we really need to talk about too, is outside of like should they be on the border of Wyndham when they're in another county, right? Outside of that question is, it's going to be very visceral when it's on your energy bills. And so raising the salience of the energy question, I think, is really important because you might not live in Wyndham, you might live where I live, your energy bill's still going to get all jacked up. And so I really think thinking through and making sure people are aware of the energy part of data centers is just as important, because that conversation, it's not as in your face in the moment, but it actually has a broader impact.
Yeah, and there's a real imbalance between the local revenue that Northern Virginia has seen for this and then the impact on people's bills. A lot of our energy comes from a wholesale market run by PJM, and last summer when they were doing auctions for the future price of electricity, that spiked 800% in one summer, and so that's not localized. That is felt throughout the state, throughout the whole region. So I guess one last follow up on data centers before we move along, and that is, do you think that the state should have a more centralized strategic planning when it looks at that data center energy demand and build out, or should we keep it with localities, or what's the mix there?
Yeah, I don't know that I have the 100% answer on that. But I think at a minimum, it's state guardrails, and I think that's what we need to do this session at a minimum, right? So that's, we passed a bill last year to put guardrails around data centers. Hey, localities, you got to consider these things when you do them. That was vetoed. That I think should pass in a more strong version this year, hopefully. I think did Danica carry that? I think Danica and Josh Thomas carried that up in Prince William. I think we need to do a pay your fair share bill at a minimum this year and think through what that means longer term. I think we need to at least at a minimum have a conversation around closing that gap with third parties, which is something the state needs to do. And from there, we haven't talked about this yet. We also need to talk about the economic incentive piece to this, and how the state thinks about economic incentives for data centers. A lot of the times when you give economic incentives, it's to build up an industry, right? Right now we're seeing the federal government take away economic incentives for solar, right, and for wind. And those incentives are there to build them up, to prop up that industry. And once it's propped up, you don't need those incentives anymore. And it's pretty robust in Virginia. I'm not sure we need those incentives anymore. So I think we need to think through some of those things. At a local level, Henrico County, when they took the taxes, and we can have a whole debate about whether Henrico did the right thing or not, but at least what they did is they said, hey, we're going to take these tax dollars and we're going to put them into this thing that's going to help the community, right, which is affordable housing. And I think the state needs to be a little bit more thoughtful about that too.
Okay, great. So cost driver one, then data centers, data center demand, just the simple laws of supply and demand. We've seen costs go up and hit households. Now I want to talk about the way that the utility, and here you're in Dominion Energy territory, has responded to that demand. We've seen Dominion plan to build 6 new methane gas plants, including one that's they would like to site just 10 miles from where we're sitting today. Yep. That's a huge expenditure. It's a huge violation of the Virginia Clean Economy Act, and it's a major contributor to bills in that the price of methane gas has been extremely volatile, especially in the last 5 years. We've seen the fuel cost part of your bill go much higher, and that's a direct pass-through to the customer. Dominion shareholders don't pay for part of that. So what can the legislature do to slow down, to stop, to respond to this I would say poorly planned plan to try and just respond with gas plants?
Yeah, the sun and wind are free. It's kind of awesome. So, yeah, I really want to frame this in the right way, because I really think it's important for people in the audience to hear this, and I really think it's important for people that care about clean energy, people that care about the environment, to think about this in the right way. I think the number one thing that needs to happen is that Democrats got to get real about building clean energy, okay? And because look, like here's the reality: we're gonna have energy, right? I always tell people I'd prefer to have clean energy. I'll take dirty energy. No energy is not acceptable, because it's just not a world that the majority of people, I think 99.9% of people, want to live in. And so we have to have clean energy, and we have to prioritize it. So in 2020, when we voted for the Clean Economy Act, we have to make that real. And that means building clean energy. And so if we want to say we don't want gas plants, which I think ultimately should be the goal, we have to build out the clean energy that we want. And we have to take the hard votes to do that. I'll give you a couple examples. One example, a bill that we did vote for and the governor vetoed was my bill with Katrina Carlson on distributed solar. Getting more distributed solar up with more companies, allowing more companies to take a share of that portfolio for clean energy. It would do a couple things. It will, when it passes next year with Abigail Spanberger and governor and General Assembly. It will pass. It will get solar where everybody agrees it should go. Landfills, brownfields, schools, warehouses, suburban areas that everybody wants them in. And it will unleash more, I don't want to say small business, because I'm not sure any solar business is a small business, but it will unleash people, not the utility, not the monopoly, to build solar as well. But distributed is not getting us there, folks, because at the state level, we can't do the subsidy that is required to build it out enough. So we can do things, that can be a significant chunk, but it can't be everything. Another bill that someone you're going to hear from carried in the past and was vetoed, next Lieutenant Governor Ghazala Hashmi, that I'm going to carry this year is around pay as you save, which is about modernizing energy in people's homes, and then they share that profit with the utility till it's paid off. That's another way to try to get clean energy, to try to get weatherization, to try to get modernization in homes. Because actually the number one way we can bring down all these carbon emissions is to just actually weatherize people's homes and to make sure homes aren't leaking energy. And then the third thing we need to do, and this is the most controversial, and this is where we need Democrats and environmental groups to get with it, is we got to build utility solar. And that's in rural areas. A lot of people don't want it. Thankfully, battery storage is getting more and more robust by the day. The governor vetoed a bill on that, which hopefully will pass, and we'll have more battery storage.
And just to be clear, batteries means that we can use solar when the sun's
not shining. Yeah. So batteries were invented like 200 years ago. They're these beautiful things that store energy so that you can use it later. I put it in my TV remote so that my remote works. And we build those at industry scale for big things. It's pretty amazing. I'm sorry to be flip, but it's kind of silly. And so we got to build utility solar too. And the reality is if you're not going to build towards that clean energy future, you're going to make it easier for the utility to build those more expensive energy sources because people need energy. And I think the point that's really important here is you're going to build that natural gas, and then the price of natural gas is going to fluctuate, and that passes through to your bill. So one of the reasons why your bill goes up, or why they ask for so much money, is because when the price goes up, you have to pay the whole thing. But sun and wind is free.
Yeah.
And so it's great. It's really pretty cool. So we really, 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 really need to get real about that. And we really need people to understand that. And we need Democrats, and we need the interest groups that surround them, present company excluded, that's us, to get with it and to care. Because otherwise, I think at the end of the day, you're going to get more of those plants. Now, we can talk about tightening up the legislation and the enforcement to make sure that Dominion's doing more of the right thing.
Yep.
I'm hopeful that we'll have a governor that'll do that. I'm hoping we'll have a legislature that'll do that. But I really think the top line is we got to build it. Voting for the Clean Economy Act, right? I think everybody just was like, oh, we voted for it. It's done. And it's like, no. The hard work has just begun, my friends.
Yeah.
The hard work has just begun, and we got to make that real.
Great. Okay. Well, there's a lot to unpack.
I know. I just put all my feelings on you.
1 minute left, but we're going to go ahead and pull that time limit away because we have a lot more to cover. So you've raised a lot there. I think let's just underscore that the second cost driver is surging fossil fuel prices, and that there's better alternatives out there. Now, you very quickly mentioned sort of tightening up the legislation that governs how Dominion's making these decisions. So I'd like to shift into that and what we call the regulatory environment. What are the rules that constrains the utility or doesn't constrain the utility, and who's really in the driver's seat on energy policy? And I say this because a 2024 census found that 1 in 4 Virginians has to make a choice between paying medical bills, grocery bills, or electric bills. During that same period, Dominion has gone to its regulators at the State Corporation Commission, the SCC, and asked to increase bills by at least $21 a month to start. And there seems to be a real mismatch there. The real crisis, the affordability crisis that people are feeling, and then what the utility's doing and the way that they're driving costs to respond to it. Now, there's a role for the legislature there, and there's a role for the State Corporation Commission in governing these activities. Do you think that Virginia has that balance right? What kind of legislation do we need to make sure that policymakers are in the driver's seat and not the utility, whose first responsibility is to its shareholders?
There's so many ways to go with this question. I wrote notes because I was like, I'm gonna miss something. I think I want to start with like a long-term solution that I think we should all want to work towards. That's not going to happen this year. Probably not even going to happen next year. But I think is the ultimate solution, which is, I think, when you look at when all these utilities were created back in the early 1900s, and how they created their model was based on build, right? They build and they make a rate of return off what they build. And that made a lot of sense back when they started, right? Because we were building out an electric system for America. Think about like the TVA and the New Deal, right? When you have like a whole swath of rural Tennessee that just doesn't have energy. And so that model made sense. I don't think it makes sense anymore to say that your money is going to be built, your money is going to come from building. I think the model that we need to think about moving towards is a performance-based utility process. Washington State has done that as an example. Other states have done that, so we wouldn't be making it up. We could look at what's worked, what hasn't worked. Senator Scott Suroville, our majority leader in the Senate, has put in he has a study that's going right now. I think it comes out.
It just came out Wednesday.
Oh, I
I'll
haven't
talk
read it
about
yet.
it when
Yeah.
you're done.
Yeah. Read it. It just came out. I'm going to read it. I didn't know it had come out. I think that's the ultimate solution, because when you're on performance-based metrics, I think if you get it right, I think that's the answer. In lieu of that, I think there's two things. There's the substance and there's the style. Okay? The substance is like making the regulatory system work for consumers. There's a whole bunch of stuff. I wrote it down here. I'll just name check a couple. We can talk about it more if you want. More frequent rate reviews, least cost analysis, moving costs from the racks, the add-ons in your bills, into the base. Tightening up the clean energy, the rules, all that type of stuff. But it's also style, and what I mean by style, process. When I first came into legislature in 2018, it was a very big year politically. A lot happened that year. 16 Democrats got elected. The whole General Assembly shifted. It was like people weren't expecting it. It was a big deal. And at the time, there had been a rate freeze that Dominion had that was going to become unsustainable. It had been put in place because of Obama. Obama was no longer president. And so at the last second, they snuck in a bill, Dominion, that they wrote. Now, I ultimately voted for that bill because I thought the bill was better than the status quo. But it was kind of a form of them writing their own bill, their own legislation. It was very controversial at the time, if you go back and watch. But that's kind of in the standard operating procedure, right? Which is a big bill, comes in at the last moment. It's really hard to read. Most legislators don't understand it. They're getting swamped by lobbyists. If you've ever been to our session, it's crazy. We're like chickens with our head cut off because we're making so many decisions every day. And I think we've already started to reform that process, is the good news. We created SEWR, the Commission on Electric Utility Regulation. We've created some processes that try to extend that out so that we're talking about these issues before the day before session, so that it's out in the open air, that people can see it, so that people like you, groups that care, can give comments. And I think we're not fully there yet, right? But I think we have started to make the process better. It's more transparent. It's a longer time, longer runway. People are talking about these issues. Shoot, we're doing stuff like this, right? Even stuff like this wasn't happening, 8 years ago. So I think the process matters as much as the substance if you want consistent results, which I think also is a nice transition into what I think is the last question about the kind of election world.
Sure.
So I think it's those kind of things.
Can I just stop you there, because you just threw out a few pretty technical regulatory solutions to this energy crisis they happen to converge very nicely with what the recommendations of this report were. So I hope that we get to a point where when Senator VanValkenburg says performance-based regulation, people cheer as much as when he said we need to build out clean energy, because it is that important. But it's very, very, I think, in some ways difficult to understand, but in other ways very simple to understand. Right now, the utilities get paid to build more. They get paid to build fossil fuel infrastructure because the incentives are baked into the system. That's why they want pipelines. They get a guaranteed 13% return on an investment in a pipeline. Can you imagine if you're a restaurant owner and you got a guaranteed 13% return on your investment? You're lucky to scratch out 1 or 2%. And so, these monopolies do what monopolies.
Well, and 13% of a fillet versus 13% of chicken.
Exactly.
You know.
So these monopolies' instinct is to build more and to seek profit. But what performance-based regulation does is take that instinct and just move it towards what is defined by policymakers to be in the public interest, to have more affordable energy, have more clean energy. And so I am glad to hear that you're focused on that Senator Serville and others are, because I think it is a way around the conflict where the utilities just not doing what we need them to do as Virginians because it's not in their business model to do that. So I'm way over time, but I do want to get to this last question, which is about this system of government that underpins all this. How did we get here? How did we get to this energy crisis? And a big part of that is that Virginia government has been very friendly to corporations. We are one of only 5 states in the country where there are unlimited political contributions from corporations to the folks that represent you all. And this is particularly egregious and acute when it comes to a public utility, a monopoly that you all regulate and are elected to regulate in the General Assembly. So can we talk a little bit about how this is going to change? What kind of campaign finance reform steps need to be taken to have a fairer system that looks after Virginians' interests?
So I could give you like my really nerdy.
That was a softball.
I could give you like my really nerdy civics teacher answer to this.
Please do.
I'm not going to do that though. I'll give you the top line answer to it, which I think is makes more sense. But yeah, we need to ban corporate giving. Yes, we shouldn't be able to take money from things we have to regulate. When we think about campaign contribution limits, we don't have any. So if you want to give me $500,000 when we leave here, I'll take it. You know what I'm saying? It's legal. We need to think about what caps are. The federal caps are too low. We should acknowledge that, because when the federal caps are that low, it just incentivizes soft money, which is worse, because then it's money that is unaccountable. You don't know where it came from. They're incentivized to say the worst things because nobody knows who's saying it. So you do want to be careful about limits, because I do think the federal limits have had unintended consequence of facilitating things like super PACs in a very dangerous way. I think the quality of the conversation's higher. I'm not saying it's high, but higher when the candidates themselves have to put their name on the ad. But we should have limits. You should not be able to give me $500,000. That shouldn't be allowed. But if you want to give it to me when we leave, you know what I'm saying? And we need to, one thing people say is we have a lot of transparency. And we do have a decent amount of transparency compared to other states with campaign finance. I don't want to pretend like we're like the worst. But we could have more.
Yeah, it's very clear. We can see the system is broken.
We can have more transparency around who gives to what. And so I think those are like the top line things, right? I mean, I don't know. I think it's a no-brainer to ban corporations from giving. Personally, it's a hot take. But those are things I think are things that we need to do. I also think when you think about like a side knockoff effect of that, right, is I think another thing is I don't think we should have a full-time legislature. So don't aggregate this. I don't think that. But I do think we need a legislature that spends more time on oversight. I don't think we need a legislature that spends more time making laws. I think January and February actually are fine for making laws. I do think we need an oversight session, time where we can just investigate, time where we can just ponder ideas, because it would help build up legislative muscles on complicated policies like energy or complicated policies like education, something else I care a lot about that people don't know much about. It's hard to learn those topics when you're spending 2 months drinking from a fire hose. And so I think thinking about how can we have a legislature that's a little bit more engaged is also part of this, because we think about the campaign side, but there's also the governing side. And people are always like, we should have term limits. I'm like, well, if you don't like term limits, I bet you don't like bureaucrats, and I bet you don't like lobbyists, because with term limits, those are the two groups that get more power. And in a part-time legislature, you're giving lobbyists and executive bureaucrats more power. And so to the extent that we can have a session that allows legislators to do basic oversight, I think that would be of value. So I would just add that point too.
Well, thank you. We're a full 10 minutes over, and we've barely
it's,
skimmed the surface. But just to quickly sum up, we talked about a few different cost drivers. We talked about data center demand. We talked about fossil fuel costs and the pass-through of fuel costs. We talked about a utility-friendly regulatory environment, and then certainly the need for campaign finance reform. Please thank Senator VanValkenburg for giving us his thoughts on this. And because we did skim the surface, I would encourage you all to learn more about this. Certainly at our website, cleanvirginia.org, we have a lot more information about this. Wes will talk later about a policy platform that touches on a lot of these issues that Clean Virginia has just released. And then there's reports like the performance-based regulation report that was released on Wednesday that cover this in a lot more detail. But thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on this.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for having me.
And with that, I pass it back to Wes.